She was 52 years old and homeless. The divorce had taken the house, the savings, and 26 years of her life, and when the last of it was settled, Ruth Ellison walked out of a lawyer's office in Knoxville with a suitcase, her father's old wooden toolbox, and almost nothing else to her name. 3 weeks later, she handed a stranger 10 $1 bills for a rusted tiny home sinking into the mud in the corner of a mountain pasture in North Carolina. The roof leaked. The floor was rotting. The scrap man was already scheduled to haul it away that Thursday. It would turn out to be the best $10 she ever spent. And the reason was waiting underneath that rotting floor, where a careful hand had hidden it long before Ruth was ever homeless, or divorced, or lost. One quick thing before Ruth's story begins. This channel runs on people like you pressing subscribe. So if slow stories about quiet people are your kind of thing, press it now and leave a comment telling us what part of the world you're watching from. We read every single one. Ruth Ellison had been building things her whole life without anyone ever calling her a builder. She was born in Kingsport, Tennessee, the only child of a Finnish carpenter named Earl Ellison, a patient man with sawdust permanently worked into the creases of his hands. Her earliest memories were of his workshop, the smell of cut pine and linseed oil, the sound of a hand plane whispering across a board. By the time she was 8, she could name every tool on his pegboard. By 12, she could set a hinge, so a door swung silent. Earl used to say that wood remembers everything you do to it, every shortcut, every honest hour, and that the only way to work it was with respect. Her mother died when Ruth was 14, and after that, it was just Ruth and Earl and the workshop, the two of them building cabinets and mantels, and one summer, an entire timber barn on a farm in the mountains near Marshall, North Carolina. Ruth was 16 that summer. She slept in a loft above the farmhouse kitchen, worked beside her father from sunup to supper, and stood inside the finished barn frame in late August, feeling something she had never felt anywhere else. The feeling that a place could hold you. She never forgot it. Then she met Gary Mercer. She was 26, working the front desk of the lumber yard where Gary bought materials for his construction company, and he was charming in the way that certain men are charming, which is to say, completely, until the moment they have what they want. They married within a year, and slowly, so slowly, that Ruth could never point to the day it happened, her life got smaller. Gary handled the money. Gary put the house in his company's name. Gary explained reasonably, patiently, why she didn't need her own account, her own car, her own work. She kept his books for 20 years and never drew a salary. When her father died, Gary sold the workshop and the tools before she could stop him. She managed to save one thing, the wooden toolbox Earl had built as an apprentice in 1961, and she kept it in the back of her closet like a secret. The marriage ended the way those marriages end. There was another woman, and then there were lawyers, and then there was the discovery that everything Ruth thought was theirs was actually his, structured and sheltered and signed away years ago in documents she'd trusted him enough not to read. Her lawyer was kind about it. He said she could fight for years and spend money she didn't have to maybe get a portion of assets Gary had already moved. Ruth was tired in a way that went down to the bone. She took the small settlement, paid the lawyer, and walked out with $2,300, a suitcase, and her father's toolbox. The money went faster than she thought possible. A motel by the week, her old sedan dying in a grocery store parking lot, and the mechanic shaking his head at the transmission. Applications at 52 for jobs that went to people half her age. By October, Ruth was down to a few $100s and a bus schedule, and she sat on the edge of a motel bed one night, trying to think of a single place in the world where she was wanted. What she thought of was the barn, that summer in the mountains, Marshall, North Carolina. She had no logical reason to go there. She knew no one. The farm's owners were surely long dead. But the memory of standing inside that timber frame at 16 was the last time she could remember feeling like she belonged somewhere. And when you have nothing left, the pull of a place like that is not a small thing. It might be the only compass you have. Ruth bought the bus ticket. The ride into the mountains took most of a day. The interstate gave way to a winding two-lane highway that followed the French Broad River, and Ruth watched the water braid itself around gray boulders while the ridgelines stacked up blue and hazy in the distance. Marshall was a river town of brick storefronts and steep streets. She took the cheapest room in town, above a laundromat, and started asking for work. It was the toolbox that saved her. On her fourth day, in a farm supply and salvage store at the edge of town, she set it on the counter while she asked the owner, a gray-bearded man named Del Ramsey, whether he needed help. Del looked at the box longer than he looked at her. Dovetailed corners, hand-cut. He asked who made it, and Ruth said her father did, in 1961, and that she'd grown up in his workshop. Del walked her to the back of the store, where a customer's antique wood planer sat half disassembled on a bench, and asked her what was wrong with it. Ruth looked at it for 2 minutes, told him the in-feed roller was worn and the knives were set uneven, and showed him the shiny spot on the casting that proved it. Del hired her that afternoon, part-time, cash. She had been working for Del about 3 weeks when he mentioned the tiny home. He brought it up sideways, the way mountain people bring up things that matter. He said he had a situation down in his lower pasture that the county was after him about, and maybe she'd want to look at it before he called the scrap man. They drove out in his truck past his farmhouse, down a rutted lane between fence lines, and there, in the corner of the pasture, backed up against a stand of hemlocks, sat a tiny house. It was maybe 24 feet long, built on an old flatbed trailer whose tires had rotted flat into the ground. The steel roof had rusted to the color of dried blood. The cedar shakes on the walls had gone silver gray and split, and some had fallen away like missing teeth. The little porch on the front end sagged. A stovepipe leaned at an angle no stovepipe should lean. Blackberry canes had grown up through the trailer frame and were slowly pulling the whole thing back into the mountain. But Ruth saw what her father had taught her to see. She saw the frame. The corner posts were true. The roof line, under the rust, ran straight as a chalk line. Whoever built this had built it right, and 40 years of neglect hadn't undone that. It was a wreck on the surface and sound underneath, and Ruth knew better than most people what that combination felt like. Del told her the story. The house had belonged to a woman named Opal Hensley, who had rented that corner of the pasture from Del's father and then from Del for over half a century. A quilter and a seamstress, kept entirely to herself, paid her little rent in cash every month without fail until last winter, when she died at 91. No family ever came. Nobody even knew who to call. The county had finally sent Del a letter saying the structure had to be moved, brought to code, or demolished, and the scrap man was coming Thursday. Ruth asked what he wanted for it. Del scratched his beard and said the law required money to change hands to make a sale official, so $10 would do it, and she could keep it right there in the pasture and work off the ground rent at the store. Ruth took out her wallet and laid 10 $1 bills on the tailgate of his truck. Del looked at the money, then at her, and asked if she knew how to sister a floor joist. She said yes. He asked if she knew how to flash a stovepipe so it wouldn't leak. She said yes. Del almost smiled, which people in Marshall would tell you was about the same as a standing ovation, and handed her a key on a loop of baling twine. Ruth stepped inside Opal Hensley's tiny house that evening with the sun going down behind the hemlocks. The door swung open on one room, perhaps 10 feet by 16, with a sleeping platform built across the far end, a narrow galley counter along one wall, a small cast-iron wood stove, and shelves on every remaining surface. The air smelled of mildew and mouse nests, and underneath it, faintly, of cedar. Water stains mapped the ceiling. The floor near the stove had gone soft and dark. On the wall above the bed platform hung a quilt frame, empty, except for one unfinished quilt, its pattern half-stitched, the needle still parked in the fabric where a hand had left it. Ruth stood in the middle of that ruined little room and felt something she had no business feeling in a place like that. It was the same thing she'd felt inside the barn frame at 16. The feeling of a place that could hold you. She slept that first night on the platform in her coat and her sleeping bag, listening to mice in the walls and wind in the hemlocks. And for the first time since the divorce, she did not lie awake doing arithmetic on her own survival. The work started the next morning, and Ruth started where her father would have started, at the bottom. You never trust a floor you haven't seen the underside of. She pried up the water-damaged boards near the stove first, then kept going, following the rot, pulling nails with a cat's paw and stacking salvageable lumber outside. The subfloor near the sleeping platform was worse than she'd feared, spongy and black along one edge. So on the third day, she crawled under the platform with a flashlight and a flat bar and began pulling that section too. That was when the bar struck something that wasn't wood. Between two steel joists of the trailer frame, tucked up under where the head of the bed had been, was a box. Not a stray crate that had slid there by accident, but a built box, fitted to the space, lined in zinc sheeting with soldered seams, the kind of thing a person makes when they intend for something to survive weather, mice, and time. It had a hinged lid held down by two toggle clasps, and the clasps were stiff with corrosion, but they moved. Ruth knelt in the torn-open floor of a house she had owned for 4 days, and she lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a small cedar chest. And inside the cedar chest was money. Envelopes, hundreds of them, in neat rubber-banded bundles, each one labeled in careful, old-fashioned handwriting with a month and a year. The earliest read, March 1979. The latest was dated the same month Opal Hensley died. Ruth opened the first one with shaking hands and found folded bills, worn soft, pressed flat by the decades. The next envelope held more, and the next. Month after month, year after year, 45 years of them. Beneath the bundles lay heavier things wrapped in flannel. Rolls of silver dimes and quarters, the old kind, minted back when American coins were still made of real silver, along with a silver thimble worn thin on one side, a black and white photograph of a young couple standing in front of a half-built tiny house, and at the very bottom, a sealed envelope that read, in the same careful hand, to whoever mends this house. Ruth sat back on her heels in the sawdust and could not move for a full minute. Then she climbed out and walked up the pasture to find Dell. He came down with her and looked at the open floor and the cedar chest for a long time without speaking. Then he said that Opal used to walk to town the first Saturday of every month, rain or shine, right up to the end, and everybody assumed she was buying thread. He handed Ruth the sealed envelope and said it wasn't addressed to him. Ruth opened it that evening, sitting on the porch step with the light going gold across the pasture, and read, My name is Opal Hensley. I was born in Madison County in 1932. I married Thomas Hensley in 1955, and he built this house for us with his own hands, meaning it to be our starter home while we saved for land. In 1966, Thomas was killed in an accident at the sawmill in Hot Springs. We had no children. People expected me to leave this little house then, but I found I could not, because he was in every board of it. So I stayed. I sewed for people. I quilted. And every month I put something away, first for reasons I understood, and later just because saving had become my way of praying. I have no family left to leave it to, but a house like this one does not stay empty. Sooner or later, it finds the person who needs it, the way it found me. If you have opened this floor, then you are that person, and this is yours. Mend the house. It is a good house. It held me through everything, and it never once let the rain all the way in. Opal Hensley, written in my 91st year. Ruth read the letter 3 times, then she folded it, put it back in the envelope, and sat on the step while the pasture went dark and the first stars came out over the ridgeline, thinking about her father and about a woman she had never met who had lost her whole future at 34 and answered it with an envelope a month for the rest of her life. She didn't cry until she thought about the unfinished quilt on the wall, the needle still parked where Opal's hand had left it. Then she cried for a while, and it felt like something frozen finally starting to move. Ruth's story is only half over, and the second half is the part Opal was counting on. If this one has earned the last few minutes of your attention, consider subscribing because it tells us to keep finding stories like hers. And down in the comments, tell us about a time you found something hidden in an old house or a family home. Someone's answer down there might become a future video. Dell drove Ruth to the bank in Marshall the following week with the cedar chest riding on the seat between them. The manager, a woman named Carlene, who had lived in the county all her life, read Opal's letter with her glasses pushed down her nose, then looked at Ruth for a long moment and said that Opal Hensley had hemmed her wedding dress in 1987 and refused to charge her, and that as far as she was concerned, the letter said exactly what it meant. The cash took 2 tellers most of an afternoon to count. The silver went to a coin dealer in Asheville that Dell had known for 30 years, a quiet man who weighed the rolls, checked the dates, and paid honest value, a little extra for the Mercury dimes. When it was all counted, the bills and the silver together came to $67,400. Ruth did not buy a new life with it. She rebuilt the one that had been waiting for her all along. She started underneath, because her father had taught her that you never trust a structure whose bones you haven't seen. She and Dell jacked the old trailer frame with bottle jacks and cribbing blocks, lifting it an inch at a time out of the mud it had settled into, checking a water level strung between the corners until the house sat true for the first time in decades. New tires and rims went on the rotted hubs, not because Ruth planned to move it, but because a house on a trailer deserves to be able to leave, even if it never does. She spent a week under the frame on a creeper board, wire brushing 40 years of rust scale off the steel, treating the bad spots, and painting the whole undercarriage with 2 coats of cold galvanizing paint, until the frame that Thomas Hensley had welded in 1955 was ready for another 70 years. Then came the floor. She sistered new joists alongside the compromised ones, gluing and through-bolting each pair the way Earl had shown her on 100 old porches, and laid a new tongue-and-groove subfloor over the compartment, which she kept. It sits under the head of the bed to this day, empty now except for Opal's letter, the photograph, and the thimble. The roof came off in October. The rusted panels shrieked as she backed the screws out, and underneath them the purlins were sound, heart pine, because Thomas Hensley apparently didn't know how to use a bad board. She screwed down new galvanized steel that flashed silver in the mountain sun, bent and soldered new, flashing around a relined stovepipe so it wouldn't leak, which had been the second question Dell ever asked her, and capped the ridge 2 days before the first hard frost. The cedar shakes took the whole winter. Ruth split them by hand at Dell's shop, working through the cold months with a froe and a wooden mallet, riving bolts of cedar along the grain and shaving each shake smooth on a draw-knife bench in the corner by the stove. Dell watched her split the first 100 without a word, then said her father must have been a patient man. Ruth said he was, and split the next 100. By spring, she had them stacked in bundles like money, and in April she sided the house 1 course at a time, the fresh cedar glowing honey gold against the old hemlocks, until the last silver-gray shake was gone. She rebuilt the sagging porch with locust posts that would outlive everyone in the county. She added 2 windows on the south wall so the little room filled with morning light, and built herself a workbench under the sleeping platform with her father's toolbox sitting open on the end of it, its tools finally back in use. Dell came down the day she finished, stood looking at the siding for a while, and said Opal would have liked knowing her rent money went to somebody who could do that. It was the longest sentence Ruth ever heard him volunteer, and the mountain community, in its slow and sideways way, took her in. Faye, who ran the diner by the bridge, started sending biscuits and soup beans home with Dell for the woman fixing up Opal's place. A retired mail carrier named Harlan, who had delivered to that pasture for 30 years, took to stopping by on Sunday afternoons to sit on the new porch and tell Ruth stories about Opal, how she left tomatoes in his mail truck every August, how she once restitched the flag from the post office when the wind tore it and never told a soul. Ruth wrote the stories down in a notebook she kept beside the letter. She felt, page by page, like she was mending something more than a house. The furniture repair work began by accident, when Faye asked if Ruth could fix a broken diner chair, and Ruth returned it stronger than the day it was made. Word traveled the way word travels in the mountains. Within a year, Ruth had a steady trade, restoring old furniture out of Dell's back shop, chairs and dressers and church pews, pieces other people had given up on. She hung a small wooden sign her own hands had carved. It said, Second Season Woodworks. Nobody in Marshall needed to ask what the name meant. She finished Opal's quilt the following winter, working slow in the evenings by the wood stove, matching the old stitches as closely as her hands could manage. It hangs now on the wall above the bed, the joined work of two women who never met, one who saved a stranger's future without knowing her name, and one who finished what the other started. On a warm evening in June, Ruth sat on her porch with coffee and watched the light come down long and gold through the hemlocks, the way it does in the mountains right before dusk, and she thought about the strange arithmetic of her life. 26 years, gone. A house, a marriage, a name, gone. And in their place, a 24-foot house that a young sawmill hand built for his bride in 1955, held together by a widow's faithfulness for half a century, and passed to a homeless woman for the price of a sandwich. Some inheritances travel through bloodlines, others travel through floorboards, waiting in the dark for the one person who would think to look underneath. That's the thing about losing everything. It strips you down to whatever was true about you before life piled itself on top. For Ruth, what was true was sawdust and straight lines and the smell of cedar. A girl in her father's workshop who could set a hinge so a door swung silent. The divorce didn't take that. Nothing could. And when she finally had nothing left but what was true, it led her straight up a mountain to the one small house on earth that was waiting for someone exactly like her. Ruth Ellison was 52 years old and homeless. She paid $10 for a rusted tiny home in a North Carolina pasture. It was the best $10 she ever spent. Stories like Ruth's don't make the news, and that's exactly why The Invisible Neighbors exists. Subscribe so the next one finds you, and send this to somebody who's starting over right now. Then tell us in the comments, what's something you had to lose before you found your way back to who you really are? We'd love to hear it. See you in the next one.